Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to Gender and Society. This is lecture number 20, the last lecture of this course. In this lecture, we are going to talk about the future of gender. So what I will be doing is I will talk about the topics that we have already covered as part of this course. And by no means that set of topics is an exhaustive list. So there are many topics that I have not covered as part of this course. And then I will walk you through a brief history of sociology and gender, and then the future of gender. So if you can recall from the first lecture that this has been the course structure that we have followed, and if you can look at each of these topics carefully, you will find that each of these topics will fit into either one of the boxes that you see on the right. So we have talked about concepts and ideologies in gender. So we have talked about some of the basic concepts, some of the emerging concepts, and the ways in which gender ideologies around gender have been built, and how those ideologies have been in a process of fluidity. Then we have talked about some of these social institutions with which gender intersects and gender matters in those institutions. So we have talked about family and marriage. We have talked about the role of technology in family and marriage. We've talked about gender and education, gender and health, the role of technology in healthcare. Then we have also talked about some of the social processes, primarily those processes that have been emerging in current times in gender studies. We have talked about the ideas of normativity, subversions, queer identities. We have talked about representation of gender in culture and media. We have talked about how gender interacts with the environment, and how gender interacts with processes of globalization. Finally, we have looked at some of the key social research methods that have been in operation in understanding the sociology of gender in society. And we have also talked about what are some of the broad patterns that are emerging in contemporary research on gender across societies, and what are some of the emerging theoretical lenses, emerging trends that we see in terms of gender research across the world. So in this lecture then, we are going to look at first a brief history of sociology to understand how gender was introduced. I did a longer history of this in the start of the course, but here I want to place gender within the larger discipline of sociology, and what are the several boundaries that we can see were drawn around gender. And then in the second half of the lecture, I want to look at some of the future trends and some of the emerging ideas that are currently in operation in society to understand gender. So, one of the starting points, if not the starting point of looking at the birth of sociology, has been in the 19th century with the French philosopher Auguste Comte. And the term sociology was coined by Comte to understand social life and the future of social life. So, what is the moral order of the society? How are people organized in society? And then, how do society progress? So, this idea of progress, this idea of moving towards a future with social life. This was at the premise of how Auguste Comte understood sociology in the 19th century. Now, around the same time, we have works of Harriet Martineau, who is an English sociologist, and she looked at the sociology of Britain. So, she translated some of Comte's work, and we find that in some of both of their work, we find that there are some reference to the idea of gender, although not in the manner that gender has evolved in contemporary times. But in Comte's work, we see that there is some discussion about men who are within these social elites should rule in the social order of the future. So there is a inclusion of gender in the conversation, although it was not an analytical category in this discussion. And in Martineau's accounts, we see that there is a discussion that women should have opportunity to fully participate in society. So, in both the accounts, you see that gender was included in the conversation. However, gender was used as a descriptor, as a variable, and they were talking about several roles. They're talking about these roles. For Comte, he was talking about men's role in the social order in the public sphere, how we understand it. And for Martineau's account, we see that there is a call for inclusion of women in the participation of operations in the society. We also see that in Martineau's work, it was identified that there was lack of three opportunities which worked as social constraints for women in society in her time. So, and these three opportunities, as were indicated, were education, financial independence, and political power. Now, see, I'm talking about 19th century sociology. I'm talking about a very, very historical context here. But the constraints, the social constraints that you see that were identified in Martineau's work, education, financial independence, and political power, have continued over the decades, over centuries, to inform how gender fares in society. So the three opportunities have remained somewhat as a social constraint or as a social determinant, however you want to term it. Education, financial independence, and political power have been three of the major areas that we see in gender scholarship that have invested in understanding how we understand gender inequality in society. So this is a very important starting point when we look at the history and situate gender within the broader scholarship of sociology, that this was identified, the set of three constraints very early on in the discipline. The next paradigm that using the sociological lens we identify is the Marx, Weber, Durkheim trio. So we talk about Karl Marx, Max Weber, and Emile Durkheim here, where in much of their work we see that progress is put as an idea of modernity. So, the way people would understand modernity is through understanding a nature of progress, how human society would progress towards the future. In their work, we do not see any particular emphasis on gender, but even if we do see reference to the idea of gender, those differences were taken as natural. The differences between women and men as a biological given, as a natural, and not socially constructed understandings of gender. And we do see that in their work, the division of the public and the private spheres exist, and much of these works also devalued the importance of women's unpaid labor within the private sphere. So, the social understanding was started at this time with an understanding that there exists two spheres, the public and the private, which are commonly guided by the the natural differences between women and men, and some actions, some labor in a particular sphere was valued more than some actions or some labor in another sphere. So, we do see the occurrence of this discussion in this part of historical context. If we look at Marx's idea of capitalism, a classic sociological lens, then we do see that Marx talked about the idea that women can gain equality by entering a formal labor force. Now, so we see that there is a call, there is and again an inclusion of understanding gender, but then from it comes an understanding that again the value for certain labor is put in a higher order than a value for another type of labor, and the way that the assumption that women already are devalued because of their participation in the unpaid labor force. If more and more women join the formal labor force, then that is a road to achieving equality in society. And this is primarily based on Marx's idea of the privatized family within a capitalist society. Now, in Max Weber's accounts, we see that there is a failure to imagine gender inequality as a social construction, and much of his work has been supported or has found ground in the natural differences, as I just talked about. And in Durkheim's work, we see that again the discussion about the natural differences continues. In his work, we see that the natural differences are supposedly going to increase as societies become specialized and the division of labor became complex. So, the premise of the division of labor would be guided by the natural differences as we understand at this point. And so, in the Marx-Weber-Durkheim part of sociology, the paradigm of sociology, we see that there is adherence to an understanding of the natural differences between men and women, which is deeply, heavily guided by the biological differences. Now, over the decades, as you have seen that gender emerged as an analytical category, that it is it moved away from an understanding of the biological condition as a quantitative variable to emerging of gender as a qualitative variable, and it started to become an organizing principle of the social world. So, we see reflection of gender order, a gender inequality, or however you want to describe it, that forms a principle of organization in pretty much every part of the social world that we live in. We have also seen that over the decades, gender has become pervasive. That is, you find it over time and space. We have seen that gender shapes identities and behavioral dispositions. So, we have, talked about multiple cases where much of these identities are negotiated, through gender, and some of the classic behavioral patterns that we have talked about are reflections of gender. Gender shapes the ways of social interactions, and this is also something we have seen throughout this course, that it is hard to talk about any social interaction without referring to gender. And then gender organizes social institutions and influences social policies. And this increasingly we have seen that it not just acts as the institutional level to offer its feedback or to offer its organizational principles, but it has also influenced social policies over time. And one of the very, very recent social policies in this regard has been in the context of conversations about parental leave. So, if you can understand the biological roles, the natural differences between female and male as they translate into parental roles. So, when couples have babies, so the idea of parental leave, when in any given society, that idea has been evolving, and this is from a very, very recent study from the World Policy Source, and you can see that in this graph, the blue line depicts the mothers and the orange line depicts the fathers, and the question they are plotting here is, how has the percentage of OECD countries guaranteeing parents of infants at least 14 weeks of paid leave changed since 1995? So, since 95, as you can see that the understanding that the mothers would need this leave more than the fathers, and that kept on rising, and that kind of remained constant, but we do see a rise in this idea that it's equally necessary for fathers here, and then we see this graph rising also. So, this societal understanding that gender is an organizing principle in social policy, and it matters, is reflected through policies such as these. Again, from the World Policy Analysis Center, we see a map of the world where it is plotted with the question that is job protection guaranteed for mothers of infants throughout paid leave. Again, something that was supposed to be biological only, to become a mother, but then over time the idea of motherhood has also evolved as a social construction. So, that is something that we have not covered fully in this course, and I encourage you to look up more on that. So, this map shows the idea of job protection for mothers of infants throughout paid leave. So, the blue areas that you see, the job protection guaranteed throughout, and we see South Asia, majority of South Asia actually has that job protection guaranteed throughout, but we do see places across the world where there is no explicit job protection, the orange areas that you see, and we do see that there is no paid maternal leave in the red areas of the world that you see. So, you see that again gender translates into many of these social policies globally. Again, from the same source, they are plotting that is paid leave available for fathers of infants, And here we see that a majority of South Asia, actually, whole of South Asia, has no paid leave for fathers of infants. And in contrast to the blue areas, the maximum, that 14 weeks or more are the blue areas, and it is guaranteed to fathers of infants. So again, gender translates into social policies in this regard, and this is a final example from the same source, is paid leave available for both parents of infants. And you see the blue areas in this map depict that entitlement for both parents, and the red areas show that neither parent, the leave is entitled. The orange areas show fathers only, which is zero country. The yellow areas show mothers only, and the light blue areas show that mother specific entitlement cannot be transferred to fathers. So we are yet to go towards a society, as a society, achieve gender equality, at least in terms of parenting, where we can envision, when we can dream of a map such as this, where we see a majority, if not all, of the world's areas colored blue, which is entitlement for both parents. So from that idea of biological roles, we have also looked at how the idea of gender has affected the understanding of the human body. And we have talked about the body as nature, or the biological constructions of the differences. The body as socially constructed, how a person perceives their body, and how a person enacts with regard to that, and the body as embodiment. So we see that much of these emerging ideas on identity, they do talk about the situated and embodied nature of the self, and we have seen how much of these ideas emerged from the early feminist movements, and situated the body in the context of the society. But recently, and more, as you can imagine, that the idea of the body is not just understood in the context of the human body, but within a larger understanding of how science and technology actually intervenes the body, and the body is now somewhere between nature and technology. So you can see that increasingly our lifestyles are guided by technology, and the human body, which was hitherto being understood either as natural, or as socially constructed, or in terms of embodiment, now is also being understood in relation to the role of technology that affects the human body. So in comparison to the natural human body, we see that the human body is produced as a cultural process, as a cultural practice, and the idea of the natural now comes in comparison with coding the body. So encoding a person with qualities, and naming them that to be natural. So the idea that a body occurring naturally versus signifying practices or processes that encodes a person, that encodes a human body, and provides a label that functions as an ideological construction of the human body. This is important in this regard because this brings in questions of representation, of how the human body is represented, and the question of power. So how is power orchestrated? How is power negotiated through the formation, through the coding of the human body, which now sits somewhere between nature and technology. So in this respect, we have the classic work of Donna Haraway, who is a biologist and later turned a philosopher of science. When in the 1990s, she brought into the conversation the centrality of science technology in influencing social change. So she introduced the idea of the cyborg, and which comes to us as the idea of a part human, part machine. And in most of her work, you will see that the cyborg, this understanding of the human body as a cyborg is constantly included into our everyday life. And we see that in the form of surgical interventions, when we have medical interventions, say a person who wears contact lenses instead of spectacles or glasses, a person who has a pacemaker inside her or his body, the surgical interventions where the body is as much a natural entity as it is also thriving through technology, and the implications of joining the human and the machine. So what happens when the human and the machine interacts? So we are increasingly getting to an age of robots, and robot Sophia has been in the news recently in this regard. So what happens when this human body is sitting in somewhere in between nature and technology, and what is happening to gender of the human body, or gender of a person, so to say, in that respect. So to understand this better, Haraway actually gives us a cyborg manifesto, which has been her most significant work in this regard. And in this, she identifies three boundary ruptures, three boundary breakdowns in this regard. The first is the boundary rupture between human and animal. The second is between organisms and machines. And the third boundary breakdown is between the physical and the non-physical. Let's look briefly at each one. So if we look at the human animal boundary breakdown, we see that primatologists, and we talked about Jane Goodall in this respect, they have discovered the complex social systems between apes and their capacity of language, the capacity of communication. And so the idea that language is unique to human culture or human achievement is no longer valid. So such studies have shown that through Goodall's study of chimpanzees, we can see that so animals, primates, they develop some sort of a communication strategy which helps them organize them as groups in their environment. And so this idea of language and communication no longer is something unique for human achievement. And there has been scholarship that talked about political comparison between oppressed people and exploited animals. And this is one way that Haraway shows us that the human-animal boundary is challenged. The second boundary that is challenged in this regard is between organism and machine. And as I just said, that machines are increasingly becoming integral to our forms of lifestyle. And I just give you some of these examples. If a person is using a respirator for regularly or quite often. So conditions such as these, when the human body becomes increasingly dependent on technology in this regard. And we also see the increasing use of writing instruments, recording surface. So the paradigm of writing on a paper with a pen is almost gone. So now you have writing surfaces, you have recording surfaces, and so much of it is actually technology driven. So that is the second point that Haraway makes between boundary breakdown between organism and machine. And the third boundary rupture that she talks about is between the physical and the non-physical, where we see the rise in importance of cultural matters, soft goods, services, media, computer, lifestyle. So the way that these soft goods or services actually percolate into our life and make up, are encoded as cultural matters, are encoded as important objects, important matters in our daily life. So in this regard, we cannot ignore the centrality of computers in human lifestyle now. So the boundaries between the physical and the non-physical is ruptured or broken down. We also see that when we talk about health of the human body, and we talked about this when we were doing the role of technology in healthcare, that gender not just is blurred by technology, but it is kind of dislocated also. And here I quote Balsamo, who says that medical authorities encourage us to monitor consumption of sugar, caffeine, salt, fat, cholesterol, and she goes on citing, through the use of such devices as electronic scales, diabetes tests, blood pressure machines, etc. So you see there is an increasing consciousness of moving towards an idea of a digital healthcare, and this is something we have seen when we were doing technology and healthcare, that we are currently the age of learning and the age of interest have gone, and we are currently in an age of implementation. So we are innovating and we are implementing newer ways of understanding health digitally, and we are slowly moving towards an age of scale where we can find out through research that what is the how can we optimize, how can we maximize the impact of these technologies on understanding human health. And we have seen at the national level in India there has been serious and concerted efforts of providing digital health care through the National Health Portal. And we also have the NDHA, or the National Digital Health Authority, to regulate, develop and deploy digital health across the continuum of care. So you see that the consciousness and the practice of digital health is actually on the rise in this regard. We also see that when we study digital health, or as I give you an example of diabetes in the technology and healthcare lecture, that there are ways of developing and understanding digital healthcare through the practice or the development of mobile analytics. So where would you start as a data collector, as a data analyst? Where would you start, and what would be your journey? How much data would you collect? How would you analyze that data? And then what sort of a output would you like to produce? Would it be an application like an app, or a website, or or a device? How do you want your analytics to actually move towards an output? And this is an emerging field, and we see more and more research is being done in this aspect. So this also brings us to an understanding that when a body functions in terms of healthcare, we have these countless apps, healthcare apps that we have currently in use in society. And these apps are not just digital tools, they're also sociocultural artifacts, they're also sociocultural products, because the users, the human bodies that are actually using, they, by using these apps, are creating new practices and new knowledge, and that is in a way producing new forms of power, as Lupton 2014 discusses. So these are some of the ways in which the human body is understood, visualized and treated in current healthcare. And as you can well imagine that the gender connotation that will come with the use of digital healthcare. For example, if we talk about apps, what sort of apps are there in the market? So that's a very good research that you can engage in to look at what are some of the gender dimensions of the apps that we currently have, and are they catering more to one category of people than to other? Is any category left out of the conversation? So you can do this little exercise to find out what sort of apps in terms of gender and healthcare are there in the market. So coming back to the idea of the cyborgs, so is it really giving us a narrative of progress? Is it really giving us some sort of framework, some sort of an understanding that we are moving towards progress? So the question is the cyborg the latest manifestation of progress and civilization? And we see that the new media technologies, the new genetic technosciences, they have coded the body, and they have made the body as codable, that you can attach signifying symbols to actually codify the human body. And we see that biology, one of the starting premises of understanding gender through the biological roles, now represents and carries representations as knowledge, as code and codable bodies. So something that was thought to be so static, so unchanging, such as biology, is now carrying fluid ideas of representation, fluid ideas of knowledge production, fluid ideas of codifying the body. So something as static as biological understanding of the body has now become very, very fluid and very, very contextual. With that, we also now look at or think about a gender future that we understand to be the queer futures, and this is something that we have also talked about in this course, that many of the understandings in queer theory is about rupturing gender boundaries. It is about that not just gender is fluid, but the idea of sexuality is also very fluid. And with that, queer theory also gives us new directions in the use of language. So how is language used? How is language creating new spaces within queer theory? So we do have new directions of identity, of gender identity, of sexual identity in society with the use of language. We do see that increasingly societies are becoming more acceptance of unconventional gender and sexuality norms, compared to the traditional ways in which gender and sexuality have been understood. And finally, we have seen that the idea of queerness, the idea of queering, is also giving us a post-structural idea of gender, which is talking about this idea of instability, this idea of fluidity that the post-structural paradigm brings with it compared to the structural paradigm. The next relationship of gender we have seen with the process of the environment, where we have seen that the several international policies and programs have been crafted around an understanding or attention with an attention to reduce gender inequality across the world. And we do see that the United Nations Environmental Program emphasizes that gender mediates human environment interactions and all environmental use, knowledge and assessment, and that gender roles, responsibilities, expectations, norms and the division of labor shape all forms of human relationship to the environment. So increasingly there is more and more attention that these ideas around gender, whether it's gender role or responsibility or expectation or however you want to define it, they contribute to human relationships that affect the environment and vice versa. So the ways that environment affect human relationship, the human division of labor, cultural norms, cultural expectations, it matters to talk about gender in this regard. And more and more policies have been looking at or investigating the relationship between climate change and gender, and how is that relationship being factored in to several of these local and global environmental policies. And we did look at the theoretical lens of ecofeminism, which talks about the duality of the nature culture, that nature is often equated with the female and culture is equated with the male, and it's a social construction that culture is valued over nature and therefore male is valued over female. So and that is one of the starting points of the theoretical premise of ecofeminism, and much of the global environmental movements related to gender is premised on that understanding of duality. So to revisit how gender has moved through time as a concept, one of the starting points is to look at how gender was introduced in scholarship from a sociology, a study of sociology of women to a sociology of gender. So as I said in the introductory lecture that when the idea of the invisibility of women as research subjects was highlighted in academia and society, more and more scholarship, more and more departments across the world in universities started to talk about the sociology of women. So you see that this sociology, which started talking about women, grew into a sociology of gender which is more inclusive, and it not just talks about women as a single category, but the various ideas of femininity, the various ideas of masculinity. So the inclusion of men in the conversation increased the scope of the study, and so the sociology of women developed into the sociology of gender. And as I just said, that there is a growing literature on men and masculinity, as we saw in a few of the lectures, that the idea of the category of men, although assumed to be universal and hegemonic, it is not really a homogeneous category. And of course there are various versions of masculinity that is negotiated in society, and more the sociology of gender is looking at that growing understanding. So men no longer are assumed as a category, as a monolithic category in society, but as gendered category. So we saw that over time gender studies became relational. So gender is how people relate to each other in society. So it is not possible for gender to exist without that relational aspect. So gender will only exist as long as it is understood in terms of relations. We see that there is an emergence of multiple forms of masculinities and femininities with relation to domination and subordination across the world. And then we see that gender's relation with other bases of distinction and stratification, as we saw in the intersectionality framework, that gender operates together with the other bases, axes of differences, axes of stratification, such as race, ethnicity, class, caste, etc. And that intersectional experience, that intersectional position, social location of a person gives a holistic or a better idea of gender experience of that person. So as we discussed, that gender is produced at the individual level, at the interactional level, and at the institutional level. So it is produced as a quality for people as they evolve into social beings. And so all the frameworks of psychology that we talked about, the cognitive aspects of human personality development relate to this level of understanding gender, that how gender is produced at the individual level. The distinctions around gender, the ideas of inequalities are produced through social relations and interactions, so social relations are becomes very important for us to understand how many of the gender inequalities actually operate through society. So in relations of social context. So how is a particular context made, how is a particular context negotiated, and what are the various gender power play that are operative in creating gender inequality in that context. Finally, gender is produced through organizational arrangements and institutions. And we have seen how there is an increase in attention to social structures and policies and practices. So at the highest level, we see that gender is and becomes one of the guiding principles of organizations, of organizational arrangements, of institutions. We talked about social institutions of family, of marriage, of health, of education, and there are other social institutions such as religion. So gender has been one of the key indicators, key contributors to many of the social arrangements that we see at the institutional level, guiding several of these policies and practices that we see. So the question then is it possible to deconstruct the gender system? Can we think of a future where we can minimize the idea of gender inequalities, a premise on which much of the gender system across the world is based on? So if we look at how gender inequalities are reproduced over time and how they're institutionalized. So reproducing inequality is one thing, and then making it the norm or making it a social order, institutionalizing it is another thing. And finally, legitimizing gender inequality. So is it possible to talk about a deconstruction of the gender system and minimize the idea of reproducing gender inequality, institutionalizing gender inequality, or legitimizing gender inequality? So the question of gender inequality becomes very, very important, very central to the idea of the understanding of inequality in this case. So, continuing with the idea of gender inequality, of reproducing and then institutionalizing and then legalizing gender inequality, we see that challenging gender inequality has become more and more a social concern, and much of the published scholarship on gender has been on gender inequality than on gender equality. So, it's obvious, it's kind of a given fact that the idea of gender inequality needs a way more attention than is thought, and scholarship is more and more invested in understanding what creates gender inequality and why is it prevailing in societies, than why do we not have a society on gender equality, because it hardly exists. So, the question here again is it possible to make gender matter less? Is it possible to create an order where gender would be significantly less influential in shaping a social order? Can gender become a less significant instrument to fashion the way things work out in a society? So, is it possible to have a degendered society? It's a question that I asked you previously, that can we have new identities and personalities formed if gender played a lesser role in shaping them? So, so here you have to step back and realize that first, what is how much of an understanding of gender is actually influencing in shaping a social norm, a social order, a social life, or a social policy at the institutional level. And then you have to think about if it is possible to attain a degendered society where we can have identities, people where gender played a lesser role in shaping them. So, is it possible or not? And is it possible to have a sort of social interaction, a sort of social relationships where people are less accountable to gender expectations, right? So, can we think of social arrangements, can we think of social relations, can we think of social interactions where human beings, where people are less obligated by gender expectations than they are currently obligated? Can we think of families, can we think of workplaces where gender did not structure tasks people usually perform? So, if you look at the classic institution, social institution of the family, or the institution of work, can we think of a social structure where several of the labor, several of the work that people do in these institutions are not guided by gender? And finally, this is what Amy Wharton would say, is that for gender equality to be achieved, gender itself must matter less. So, can we go and think of a society where we can think of the impact, the influence of gender as much less and much less influential, and that is one of the strongest roads to attain gender equality. So, in summary, I just want to remind you, the various aspects that gender and society as a course have given you, and I am sure that you have benefited from these understandings, is first a difference between biological self and cultural self. So how we define the biological role, the biological body, and the cultural perception of a person. The next idea that we have looked at throughout this course is to find patterns in society. So what are some of the patterns in terms of gender that is operative in society is something that we have looked at. We have identified stereotypes. We have identified gender stereotypes as they are constructed, as they are deconstructed, as they are challenged, or as they are reinforced. We have looked at natural laws versus emerging social theory, and we have talked about the importance of social theory in terms of its context, in terms of its history, and in terms of its ideological contributions. We have talked about the various institutional structures, the various power geometries, how resources are allocated, how resources are made accessible by certain categories of people, for certain categories of people. We have looked at several of these gender dimensions in social institutions, how organizations of social institutions matter on the basis of gender. We have talked about research methods in gender, where one of the starting points is to ask the 5 W's of who, what, when, where, and why, and that becomes important for us to start questioning about what is it about gender that we want to analyze. And of course, we have paid a very, very significant attention to historical contextualization of gender as a process, as a concept, and what have been some of the key historical moments that have shaped gender over time, over space, over generations, and where we are in terms of our understanding of gender. So this brings me to the end of this course, and I want to end with the question that I started this course with, and I want to go back to this question and ask you again that why does gender matter to you? So if you revisit the various lectures and the concepts that we have talked about in this course, and now look at this question one more time at the end of this course, and try to reflect on, now having listened to the journey of gender, why does gender matter to you? So as a closing, I would like to direct you to some of the recommended readings that will probably give you a much deeper understanding of gender. So please take a look at these readings, and please continue reading about gender, continue talking about gender, and continue about talking about a world where we can think of gender equality more than gender inequality. Thank you.